Hi, I'm Dana Brownlee, and if you're like me, I know so many Americans are struggling with the results of the election. On both sides of the aisle, so many people are in a state of either depression or despair, or if not, just numbness and shock. But one of the silver linings for me as a corporate trainer and someone who works in the area of leadership is the opportunity to look back on the election, look back on the campaign, and try to find some leadership lessons that we can all learn from. So I found 6, and I'd like to talk about them briefly on this video. Number 1, perception absolutely is reality. And I think that this is an issue that certainly dogged the Clinton campaign. It was very obvious, very clear that the candidate struggled with certain negative perceptions. She was perceived as being aloof and distant and maybe not as in touch with the American electorate, or maybe not caring quite as much. And what I see with leaders is the typical reaction is defensiveness and refuting the validity of the perception. But the reality is you can't refute a perception. You can refute a fact. So many of her handlers and those close to her would argue, well, no, she's great when you get her one-on-one. She's great behind closed doors. And I just got the impression that they never really acknowledged and recognized the importance of dealing with the perception and how unimportant it was to try to validate, deny, acknowledge the factual basis of the perception. So let me just give an example of what I'm talking about. If your child comes to you and says, Mom, I really don't think you love me, or your spouse says, I really don't feel like you love me, you have a problem. Whether you love the person or not, the mere fact that there's the perception that that love isn't there in and of itself is the problem. And just as a voter, I never got the impression that the campaign really got that. Even though there were lots of Saturday Night Live skits about it, I don't know that they really got that, hey, the fact that there is this perception is in and of itself a problem. Again, too many leaders think that, hey, if I don't agree with it, then hey, it doesn't impact me or it's not real. Let's face it, you may not agree with gravity, you may not fully understand gravity, but if you jump in the air, you're coming right back down. So that's the first lesson. Number 2, don't confuse an amazing resume with an amazing leader. And I think that so many leaders make this mistake as well. When you think about the Clinton campaign, for me, it was a lot about her resume. And her resume was amazing. It was stellar. It was exceptional. But interestingly enough, when she ran against Barack Obama, who had much less experience, she wasn't able to defeat him. So just because you've got the litany of experiences, and hers are just absolutely bar none, when I look at what are the qualities that make a leader just a great leader, there are those intangibles. There's the charisma. There's the oratorical ability. There's the ability to really motivate and inspire. And so many people would argue that Barack Obama had so much of that, even though the resume might have been a lot thinner. So again, the second leadership lesson, don't just assume that because someone has checked all the boxes and they've been here since we turned the lights on and, hey, it's their turn, that they're going to be a great leader. I've seen that mistake made so many times. Lesson number 3, an apology without sincerity probably not an apology. Most of us who paid any attention to the election, I'm sure, noticed how the email scandal dragged on and on and on. And I put it in air quotes because I have to say at the outset that clearly I feel Secretary Clinton was held to a ridiculous double standard as compared with her component. But that aside, the reality is we all make mistakes. Every leader makes a mistake. And so again, going back to perception, when there is the perception that probably should be dealt with and also something really should be apologized for. There was some sort of misstep. The best way to handle that is to, I call it stab. If you're going to take a stab at it, is to be S, sincere, T, timely, A, authentic, very authentic. If people don't feel that sincerity, the authenticity probably wasn't quite there. And then be brief. Unfortunately, with the Clinton campaign, I feel like they were anything but. The New York Times wrote an article, I believe September 11th, called Hillary Clinton's Long Road to Sorry over email use. And they chronicled all the different iterations of the apology. And so instead of her just kind of dealing with it and getting over it and letting us getting over it, it kind of marinated in our psyche for weeks, which turned into months, which was so difficult. And, one of the most problematic parts of it for me were when she started with what I would call the kindergarten excuse. Well, all the other secretaries of state did it. So, again, I think it's so important for leaders to remember to pull back and avoid the temptation to be defensive or react defensively, but instead take a stab, be specific, timely, authentic, and brief. Next lesson is really try to focus on your blind spots. They're called blind spots for a reason. Everyone has weaknesses, but the ones that are the most dangerous are the ones that you can't really see yourself. And my sense is that the Clinton campaign may have suffered from the same problem that I see in a lot of corporate America, where leaders, instead of really looking for those blind spots, they surround themselves with people who pour accolades on them and simply just tell them how wonderful they are. That might feel good, but I promise you it's not terribly helpful. So again, there were weaknesses, there were blind spots, and I just wonder if more attention had been paid to addressing those weaknesses and trying to improve upon those weaknesses, she might have been better served. Next one, number 5, don't take your superstars for granted, or your workers who are just consistently performing. I remember on election night when the state-by-state results started coming in, and Michigan looked a little wobbly, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and the pundits started talking about, wow, the blue wall is crumbling. These were the states that she had in the bag that she didn't really have to worry about. And I remember some of the commentators talking about how some of the local party officials had expressed real concern over the last several weeks of the campaign, that she wasn't making as many stops there, that she needed to give those states more attention. But strategic decisions were made to kind of fly over those states and focus more so on the states where she wasn't doing as well in the polls. And I think that similarly, that's a very dangerous approach for leaders to take, but it's all too common. It's unfortunate that sometimes the dysfunctional people on our teams, or the non-performers, or the difficult people take up much more of our energy than those people who are consistently coming in and day out and doing a great job. And what tends to happen is we put those relationships on autopilot. We don't focus as much on them. We don't put as much energy into them. If anything, instead of recognizing them, we really might punish them because we keep giving them more and more work, because we can't trust the non-performers over here, so we're just going to give it to the superstars. So my leadership caution there is that's a really, really dangerous approach. You cannot take your superstars and your consistent performers for granted. If you do, you will have morale issues, you might have defections, and then you're left scratching your head wondering why they want to go somewhere else. And finally, number 6, don't be tone deaf. I think that if we learned anything from this election, it should be that you have to listen to the people. You have to have your ear to the ground. You cannot just stay in your penthouse or in your little bubble of elitism and not be connected to that person working on Main Street. And similarly, in organizations, it's really hard once you ascend hierarchically so high. It's really hard to maintain that connection with all levels of people, of staff within your organization. And I think that both sides of the aisle really, really struggled with this. Particularly on the Democratic side, I felt that this was the case. Clearly, people were clamoring for change, and it almost seemed like the establishment was just ignoring that. The establishment leadership was just ignoring that. We saw thousands and thousands of people rallying for Sanders. They wanted change. They wanted something new. They wanted something different. But for some reason, it seemed that the Democratic leadership had just decided they had picked their candidate, and that's who they were going for. Interestingly enough, my daughter, during the time of the election, was asking me, she's 7, Mom, what's democracy? And I tried to think about a 7-year-old definition that I could give her that would really work. And so I boiled it down to 3 words: the people pick. And that, I think, is so powerful. It's about the people pick. It's not about you as the leader necessarily. It's about the people. And having that loss of connectedness is the kiss of death in so many ways. On the Democrat side, one can argue that not only were they connected and not listening, in many ways, if you look at what was revealed with WikiLeaks, they were almost subverting or attempting to subvert the will of the people by really supporting one candidacy much more so than the other. So the last lesson, do not be tone deaf. You've got to have your ear to the ground. You've got to know what people want, where their pain areas are, and be poised to take action. So these are my 6 leadership lessons from the election. I hope you find them helpful. Thanks so much.